Well, good evening, everyone. Really exciting to introduce all of these amazing people to you all this evening. Jay Smith, unfortunately, can't be with us. He's up in the mountains. He may join us a little bit later. Murad sends his apologies as well. Perhaps he may join us a little bit later if it's possible. So I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself. Perhaps Bala, if you could introduce yourself to the audience first.
Namaste to everybody. Namaste, Lloyd, Odon, Paul. It's been a long time since I spoke on this platform, and today's topic interested me a lot because this is something which I'm interested in. My area of interest lies in the point that Islam originated in the Umayyad period, and all its vital organs of Islam, such as Mecca, which is and the Quran, I believe originated in the Umayyad period. So I felt that this is very much within my domain. So I've come here to share my 2 cents. Thank you.
Fantastic. Lloyd, how about you introduce yourself?
All right. Well, thank you, Mel, for having me on. Hi, everyone. My name is Lloyd de Jongh. I am South African. I live in Warsaw, Poland, and I spent 11 years living in the Middle East. I worked in a national defense role. I was responsible for consulting as well as practical implementation of border security and critical national infrastructure systems, which were there to defend various Middle Eastern countries against incursions and acts of sabotage or destruction by groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Iranian National Guards Corps. And I spent a lot of time immersed in the culture. I've traveled extensively across the entire Middle East, and I saw a lot of these places firsthand. So I've been everywhere from northern Iraq to the Bekaa Valley in the Lebanon. And so I've seen a lot of these issues and the dysfunction up close and personal, and thus I've became very interested in what caused this. So I've got lots of practical experience within the region, with the people, and my expertise and what I cover on my channel is Islamic law, what is known as the Sharia and the Fiqh of Islam. So I do detailed studies of the Islamic law across the 4 schools. And also I study the Sirah of Islam, which is they're known as the biographies of Muhammad, but really they are the Gospels of Muhammad. And within the Sirah, really it's where Muhammad's deity is discussed. And also one point that I will raise before is that within the Islamic law, within the Sharia, within the Fiqh, Islam is explicitly stated to be a Gnostic religion. It is explicitly called Gnosticism, and the scholars are explicitly called Gnostics. Can't hear you.
Lloyd, thank you very much, and sorry about the mute. Paul Ellis, could you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul. I live in London. I'm a former barrister. I'm now a teacher, and I've been very interested in Islam, particularly, and not as long as many people, for about sort of 4 years or so. My particular interest is in the Quran itself, in interpreting the Quran in the light of its biblical subtext and its antecedents, and trying to work out what the Quran actually means. I think there's a lot of perception, that at least there was when I started taking an interest, that the Quran itself is basically jumbled up nonsense. It's full of mistakes. It doesn't actually mean anything, leaps from one topic to another for no obvious reason. My experience of reading books and articles on it by academics is that there's a great purpose and a meaning and a structure to the Quran that's historical. So I'm very much interested in teasing this out. It's a job which is vitally important, and which the human race has only really been making a serious attempt at in the last 50 years. And we've still got a very, very long way to go. So that's my particular interest. Perhaps, if I may say, I just push my own little theory. The one theory I've come up with that I think has gained the most traction is what I call the Jerusalem thesis, and that is that the Masjid al-Haram is in fact the Jerusalem temple, or the site of the Jerusalem temple, and that when the Quran talks about expel them from where they have expelled you, I put this in the context of the Byzantine-Sasanian War, and it's Muhammad was actually leading a military expedition to capture Jerusalem. That's my big idea upon which many of my other ideas hang.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm just going to respond to a question in the chat there. Someone asked for my email, sneakerscorner@hotmail.com. Okay, and now I'm going to pass on to Odon, who will be familiar to many in the audience. Would you like to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you, Mel, for having me. Yes, I'm Odon Lafontaine. I live in Paris, and it's been 10 years plus or more since I've been working on Islam, especially with Dr. Edouard Marie Gallet, or Galès, who wrote a thesis about the origins of Islam in 2004. I've published a book, The Great Secret of Islam, Le Grand Secret de l'Islam, with him, which explains his thesis and develops it in the light of new discoveries, and mostly what Galès and what the scholars are about to discover is that the Islam at the origin did not exist as the standard Islamic narrative told us, but it was about the waiting of the Messiah in Jerusalem. And I think Paul is on the very right track here. People were waiting for the Messiah to come in Jerusalem. He did not come. He did not establish God's kingdom on earth. And then the Arab leaders took it upon themselves to establish God's kingdom on earth and created Islam to justify their power. And so, and here maybe we will have a little debate with Lloyd. At the beginning, Islam was very much a messianism, not as much as a Gnosticism, but it evolved into a Gnosticism, I think, due to the construction of the religion and the many influences of Shia Islam and Persian and Eastern religions and creeds. So, and about Jerusalem and Mecca, I think Mecca is a complete forgery. There was no Mecca at the beginning, and Mecca was created in order to give some flesh to the standard Islamic narrative and to comply with what the Quran says. But the Quran is not about Mecca, it's about Jerusalem, as Paul explained it. And so they created Mecca in a two-step fashion. First, as the new place of Abraham, and secondly, as the place of origin, the place of birth of the prophet. And they create it so that it mimics what the Quran tells about Jerusalem.
Okay. Thank you, Odin. You kind of led into what my opening question was going to be. It's just simply we're going to be asking the question, why do we think Mecca was chosen and so on? But first of all, I suppose to start off, what is your opinion about the idea that it wasn't there in the early days, that it wasn't there at, say, in the early 7th century when Islam was meant to have begun? So just like to do a round robin with you all. Bala, what's your view on this idea that there was no Mecca in the beginning?
Well, I would like to stick to Patricia Crone's words that the incense route between Yemen and Syria could not include Mecca because it was out of the way for that particular trade route, because the ancient civilization was turning into the medieval ages, and the cities were supposed to lie on trade routes such as the Silk Route or the incense route or the musk route, or etc. etc. So it was basically trade which was connecting different civilizations, and Mecca, I think, was a way too far away from the usual traditional route. So I think it has no sense to exist. And of course, the other historical antecedents and the other sources also corroborate what Patricia Crone has told us. So there was no Mecca let's say at least till 690s or 695. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Paul, do you want to maybe give a summary of your thoughts on this question of Mecca? Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the place, Mecca in Hijaz, I think it's fair to say that there is absolutely no evidence that it existed in the early 7th century or the mid 7th century. There's not a shred of evidence, not a shard of pottery, not a coin, not a single inscription, not a mention anywhere. There is simply no evidence that it was ever there. I think that doesn't prove that there was nothing there, but there's no reason to think that there was anything there, and no reason to imagine that there was anything there, given the climate, the inhospitable territory, the lack of any obvious advantage in its position. It's not on a trade route. There's no reason to think that there's anything there. On the other hand, two things that I find quite intriguing are that there is something that ties in with Islam. There are two things, physical objects, that don't seem to play any part in the Quran story and seem to appear at Mecca, and they're connected to Mecca. One of them is the black stone. To me, it's inconceivable that the person who wrote the Quran would have had any sympathy at all for people parading around a black stone or kissing a black stone or anything like this. This seems exactly the sort of thing that the Quran author would have been horrified at and would have beheaded anyone who suggested such a thing. The other one, which is slightly more mysterious, is the Maqam Ibrahim, the standing place of Abraham. There's this object which, as it happens, is only a few yards away from the black stone. It's a block that's got two great indentations in it, which in some way look like stylized footprints, but they're not really footprints. Islamic tradition has some rather half-baked idea that this is where Abraham stood, and that's why the Quran talks about the standing place of Abraham, or standing place of Abraham. Well, here's a block of stone with two footprints in it. That's where he stood. But it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the story at all. There's no reason why Abraham would have stood on this block and has sunk into it, or why he had such huge feet. Nobody can really make any sense of it. So it looks to me as though there is a black stone and you've got the Maqam Ibrahim, and whether they were at Mecca in the Hijaz and there was some temple there and the Muslims came and Islamified it, or whether they have a totally different story that began somewhere else and was brought there, I have something of an open mind about at the moment. But there is something there that's not Islamic. That would be my main observation.
Okay. I know this is not your main area of focus, Lloyd, but would you like to give any thoughts in relation to that question of Mecca?
A couple of thoughts. I do agree with Bala that Mecca is not on the trade route. It's too far west of the land route, and it's too far east of the sea route. And Patricia Crone does ask what commodities enable the inhabitants of this barren site to engage in commerce on what was apparently such a large scale. And there is no evidence before the 8th or 9th century to verify that Mecca existed. So there's no early record of it. And I will note that from Islamic law, lying is explicitly allowed within Islam. And in fact, just as the Eskimos have like 20 words for snow, Islam has something like 20 words for lying, right? And everyone knows about taqiyya, but there's a whole bunch of others that they've never heard of. So if lying benefits Islam, then lying is not only permissible, but obligatory. And if lying causes confusion and ignorance in others, and if this is of benefit to Islam, then this is permissible. So there's no reason to believe anything that you're told. And along with that, I would say that perhaps they wanted a place that was completely barren, a blank slate where they could start fresh with their utopian caliphate, and they could just start with a new narrative and establish themselves. They wanted something free of history, free of any kind of associations. That may be the case.
Let me just see if my audio's on. Yeah. And over to Odon. What's your thoughts on that whole question?
Oh, I fully agree with everyone here. I would like to point at an argument that Muslims often make about Mecca. They say that the absence of proof is not the proof of absence. But in this case, we just have to look at the positive evidence we have for an Islamic Mecca. And as Paul stated it, there is none. There is absolutely none in terms of facts, artifacts, coins, relics, archaeology. And the only evidence there is scriptural evidence. It is the Sirah, it is the Islamic tradition. But when we really look into the Sirah and the Islamic tradition, we see that everything that pertains to Mecca actually points to Jerusalem. And so the evidence, the only Islamic evidence there is, crumbles, collapses. And this forces us to think that there was no Mecca at all, and that Mecca is a pure invention, a complete invention. And I have other points to make, but this first one I think is very important. The only Islamic evidence is no evidence at all.
Okay, there's a viewer that has mentioned that your audio is a bit low, Odon. So feel free to pull out your microphone if that helps. I have a question kind of to follow up that last question, which is, surely they would have picked a location with biblical links to support the general narrative, but they picked a place with no biblical links from at least on the face of it. Would you like to just give your thoughts on why they picked a place that was so barren and so devoid of biblical links? So that's a sort of an open question. Who'd like to take a stab at that? Paul, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very struck by the image of Tom Holland in his documentary, Islam, The Untold Story. And has this great, he hints at the Jerusalem thesis, but he doesn't come out and say it. It spends a lot of time showing pictures and footage of Jerusalem and hinting that that's where it all was, but he doesn't actually say this is where the Quran is talking about. And then he moves to a scene where he's walking through the desert. It's almost knee-high in shifting sands, and the camera is panning around him, and he says, I forget the exact words, but all you see is emptiness. You come to the desert, you think you're on the outside of the desert, and you think it's empty, and then you come into the desert, and all you see is emptiness. And I think that's a very compelling image. I also very much like your analogy, Mel, and I've mentioned it in the past, and I love it. The comparison with Las Vegas, where you can create any fantasy you want to in the desert. There are no people, there's no history, there's nothing to build around it. You can have your own little fantasy there. So why they went to the Hijaz, in my view, is essentially negative. They wanted to have no biblical associations. That's not a mystery, a scratching your head. Why did they go somewhere with no? That's the point of it. If they wanted somewhere with biblical associations, they would have stuck with the truth. And the truth is that the Quran is largely about Jerusalem and about the Jewish people and the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's what the Quran is really about. The reason they put it somewhere else is to make it negative, to make it inaccessible, to create an entirely fictitious. And once you're there, it doesn't really matter what the story is. The story just has to fit around the words of the Quran as far as possible. But the point is to separate it. I would take I respectfully slightly disagree with something that Lloyd said, if I may. Great respect to Lloyd. I don't think they were trying to build anything in Mecca. The evidence I see from early Islam is that Mecca was not much more prominent after the Arab conquests than it was before. we talk about the manuscripts and the different stemma of the early manuscripts, and you talk about the Basran and the Damascus and the Jerusalem traditions, and you don't really have a Meccan. There's one single manuscript, I think, that they call the Meccan tradition, but there's no obvious link with Mecca as far as I could see. And one talks about the legal traditions. We talk about jurists, and again, they're all from Damascus, or they're from Basra, or they're from further east, or they're in that world. They're not there's not a strong Meccan legal tradition, and so one gets the feeling that not many people went to Mecca in the first century or two. It doesn't seem they were building anything there. It was a name that was just deliberately put somewhere where nobody was ever likely to go. I take.
Okay, Bala, you would like to come in on that?
The story of Islam, at least for its first century and a half, seems to be a struggle between the Umayyads and the non-Umayyads on the other side. And the Prophet and the other people seem to belong to the non-Umayyad stream. So it is a tussle between the effort to put Mecca far away from the Umayyad political and religious control seems to be the focus of the person or the group of persons who shifted the black stone from somewhere in the Umayyad territory or the border of the Umayyad territory deep down into the desert where the Umayyad armies or the long arms of the Umayyad Caliphate cannot reach. So that seems to be the primary motive of the person or the group of people who shifted Mecca to that place. Now, why could it not have been Medina where they could have shifted the black stone? Is because the puritanical or the initial Muslims and their descendants, the believers, I mean, I'm sorry, I used the word Muslims. The initial believers and their descendants seem to have dwelled in Medina. So this particular site had to be at Medina or anywhere southern territories to Medina, not too close to Yemen because they have a very other distinct Sabian or cult that they followed. So they wanted to balance between this Medinian territory and the Yemeni territory. As you will see in the later Umayyad period, these two developed into two different parties, the northern Qais party and the southern Yemeni party, which played a huge role in the Umayyad politics in the later Umayyad Empire. So the whole point is they chose this site was chosen, the geography was chosen to keep it away from Umayyad hands. And what is odd is I've already mentioned in the chat, and I'm talking to friends in the live chat as well, is that usually victors get to write history. Winners take it all. But here, the Umayyads were the victors. However, for reasons beyond their control, okay, the politico-religious seat of the caliphate got split, and the Umayyads remained only political figures, whereas the religious figures crowded at Kufa or Medina, way far away from Damascus and Jerusalem. And they made sure that the Umayyads don't have a say in the making or the evolution of nascent Islam. Thank you.
Thank you. Lloyd, would you like to come in on that?
No comment. I'll listen for a while and I'll see what if I have something else I can comment on.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I come to the rescue of Lloyd. I don't think the point you made about the Umayyad Bala is that valid because I think Mecca was chosen as the place of origin of Islam by the Abbasids way after they conquered the power, and there were no more Umayyads to challenge them. And but I agree with you. The place had to be remote, had to be remote from the Judeo-Christian Levant, from the Jewish and Christian Yemen, and also I think this is an idea I got from a scholar friend. It had to be remote from Baghdad, because you see the Abbasid coalition that took the power from the Umayyads was formed with warriors Arabs, mostly Persians, and a sort of religious core. I think mostly made by Shia or future Shia Muslims. And I think the central power of Baghdad wanted the religious away from them. They also choose Mecca to keep them away and to not have them at the very center of their power. And this is also, I think, one of the reasons why it is so remote. And all of the other reasons, it is an empty place which has no history, no one to challenge the reconstruction of a new ideological history. All of this is very legit, very valid, I think. But we also have to take into account the very odd nature of the Abbasid power, which was a mix of warriors and religious people with very strange ideas.
Okay. It sounds to me that Mecca was kind of like the Goldilocks location in the sense that it was just far enough south, not too near the north, not too near the south where the Yemenis are, not too near the sea. So it just happened to be in the right location. It seems to me that there was nothing significant about that. Bala, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I want to respond to Odon. Odon, I think we see the first non-Muslim mention of Mecca in 742 AD in Continuato Byzantio. So the place Mecca was recognized, and even Dan Gibson also says that the first Mecca-facing mosque was made in Banbor in Pakistan in 727. So what happens is this site has come up well within the Umayyad period, which is my a field of study, because
I think so. I think so also.
Yeah. So so it is the Abbasids would have liked to shifted the place from Mecca to back where it was actually. I would come up with the three Kaaba hypothesis in a while, a pre-Islamic three Kaaba hypothesis in a while. But the site of Mecca is certainly pre-Abbasid. That's what I'm trying to tell here, Odo. Thank you.
I also think the site is pre-Abbasid. There is another point we should really have in mind. It is all this thing with the black stone, as Paul said it. The cult of the black stone is not Islamic. It is something very different, very ancient, and the proto-Islamic creed could not have been about the black stone. This is something else. So I think maybe that the Umayyad Mecca, when the Umayyad took over Mecca and established something there, maybe it had something to do with the black stone. And maybe this is why the first mosques were pointed to this site, Mecca, especially the Bambor Mosque in Pakistan.
Okay. Maybe
Mel,
open it up to anyone there. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Mel, we are given to understand that there were these three Kaabas. There is the black one that was somewhere in northwestern Arabia, somewhere near Petra. Then there was a white Kaaba with the Lacumites, who were centered at Hijaz near Kufa or Basra. And then there was a red colored Kaaba, which was in Yemen, which was the center of the Sabian worship in Yemen. Now, they wanted to have a midpoint between these three Kaabas so that there can be a reconciliation between these three different, the Ghazanids, the Lacumites, and the Sabians or the Yemeni people. So they wanted to have a midpoint between this. That is what I'm trying to tell you. It was not even in the center of the Zubairid Caliphate, where Ibn al-Zubair can, go ahead and place it right in the middle of his caliphate, maybe somewhere near, a little more further north near Muta or near Tabuk, which is places associated, generally associated with the Prophet. Now, being the spiritual son of the Prophet, you could have reckoned it to have been placed somewhere in Mecca, or Tabuk or Muta or even Taif, just like someone in the comment section is suggesting that it could have been there. So I think they're trying to figure out a geometrical midpoint between this black, white, and red Kaabas. That is my hypothesis. Thank you.
I just have thoughts on that. Sorry, yeah.
Yes, go ahead with your point. Sorry, Lloyd.
No, on that, I mean, it definitely sounds valid, and Bala knows more about that than I do. But also, if they were in a more populated urban center, the fact of the Islamic plagiarism, the syncretism from all of these different religious and Gnostic traditions would be instantly recognized. If they shifted it away from a place, well, if they shifted it to somewhere remote, the plagiarism wouldn't be noticed, and they could then get away with growing this nascent form of Islam. If they were in Jerusalem, they'd be known immediately for having stolen from this group, stolen from that group, taken from the Talmud, taken from this tradition, that tradition, the Manichaeans, you name it. They swiped from everybody. So I think it suited a number of different, it suited a number of different criteria that they may have had, and it gave them this ability to hide the fact that they'd simply just created this thing.
Okay, so an idea that I have in my head is perhaps, was there a secret agreement with the Byzantines? The Byzantines were not happy with them occupying the holy site for Jews and Christians, and they basically agreed to pull back to another location. Could that carry any water, or do you think it actually, no, it's more a case of they just needed a blank slate? Probably not.
I think as I mentioned before, that the aim is to try and separate the Quran from its meaning, and to create an entirely fictitious life of Muhammad, to separate it from what really happened. And my reading of the Quran now is very much that Muhammad, I'll call him Muhammad, the principal author, the guiding mind behind the Quran, saw himself as a new Moses. And he saw the opportunity to invade Palestine, and he clothed himself in all the language, all the biblical and Judeo-Christian language, to give himself the trappings of a new Moses. And all his polemics against the Jews were all against to say, well, the children of Israel have had their chance, and now it's time for the children of Ishmael to take over. God has given up on them. He's replaced them with something better. So he's very much, the Quran itself is saturated with biblical references, and the aim is simply to separate. And the aim of Mecca, like so much like the whole of the narrative, is to separate the Quran from its true meaning. There are a couple of points that the guys have made. One is Bala seemed to say, and it's a view I'm not committed on, but I'd very much welcome if he could go into a little more detail of his thoughts. He seemed to say that the black stone was taken to Mecca, that it was somewhere else, and then I think it was probably taken to Mecca. And that's, of course, Dan Gibson, the heart of Dan Gibson's thesis, that Abdullah ibn al-Zubair was besieged, and he evacuated the black stone and sent it into the Hijaz for safekeeping, and then he was defeated, and his people are left basically holding this sacred relic, and they set up a shrine, and that later became merged with the story of Islam. Is that Bala what you think? Some story a little like that? The other point that was mentioned is perhaps it's mixing two ideas together. We were talking about the Arab Byzantine Chronicle, and how that mentions Mecca. But that mentions Mecca, but it puts it up in the Mesopotamia. So it's got the name Mecca, which of course is in the Quran itself, but not Mecca in Hejaz, is it?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that one. It could, my sense of it is perhaps they knew that it was at the location of one of the stations of Abraham, and they assumed maybe that it was somewhere like Ur or Haran or somewhere like that, and that's how it got all mixed up. But yeah, go ahead, Lloyd.
Thanks. Just to note that while there are these references to Moses, and Muhammad does claim himself to be the successor of Moses, shall we say, it's when you go into the various seerah, the quote-unquote biographies, but really the Gospels of Muhammad, that you discover that Muhammad he becomes the counterfeit Jesus. He becomes the new Jesus, where Jesus is what they call the Messiah. Muhammad becomes the King Messiah. So he one-ups Jesus in every single way. Now, it should also be noted that for lay Muslims, and we are not even Muslims, so we're not at that level of, shall we say, initiation, the Quran sits at a level of knowledge that the scholars call the Ibara, which is the plain level. It's the absolute bottom, lowest level of knowledge. And lay Muslims are not allowed knowledge above this level. There are three additional levels, the Ishara, the Lata'if, and the Haqa'iq. So if you're only studying what's in the Quran, which is quite literally termed Islam for the masses, the Ibara level is Islam for the masses, Islam for the plebs. And the greater knowledge of these further three levels are for the initiates, the scholars. Then you have one perception of Islam. But once you get into the Sharia, which the ijma is when you take all of the knowledge that's in the Quran, in the Hadith, in the Sirah, and so on, and there's all these opinions, and the Quran is abrogated, the Hadith are abrogated, Hadith abrogate Quran, Quran abrogates Hadith, and they all abrogate each other. Then you've got all these opinions in the tafsir. But once you sort all of this mess out, you have the ijma, and the ijma, the consensus, is found within the Sharia and the fiqh. So to look beyond the Quran, so the ultimate knowledge of what's in the Quran is in the ijma, which is found in the Sharia. And that's where you get additional knowledge. And that also, once you look at the Sirah, you look at the deeper personality, the legends, the myths, the miracles of Muhammad, then you discover he's the replacement of Jesus. And so on. So you get a different perspective as well that adds knowledge that you wouldn't have from reading the Quran alone, which is designed to be vague.
So now the time period that we are talking about, Islam was very fluid. It was not so concrete or rigid like Lloyd is saying. I'd like to respond to Paul. Yes, Paul, I would like to subscribe to the views of Dan Gibson as far as the Zubairid revolt is concerned. And looking at the perspective of the origins of the Momin movement, the believers movement itself, it seems to be a rebellion against the Sasanian rule. Because I request all our friends here and the listeners also to refer to a map given by Khodad Reza Khani in his book Reorienting the Sasanians. Now, in that he refers that in 621, Khusro had essentially encircled Arabia from all sides. Egypt belonged to him. Yemen and Oman was his. He was from Persia. He had covered up the entire Levant region, and he had gone up till Turkey. So all the territory that was left out for the Prophet was the Hijaz region. Now, in that region, all the sacredness of what is the true ethos of the Arab culture had accumulated there, with the Lakhmids being decimated, the Ghazanids being compromised, and Abu Sufyan himself being that. And we see that Mecca itself is a copy or replica of some other center which was falling in the Sasanian territory at that point in time, in 621, just before the pre-Hijra period. So initially it started off as a rebellion against the Sassanids, and once they were successful against the Sassanids, they turned their attention against the Byzantines. Just like Mel mentioned, their focus was to de-Romanize or de-Byzantinize their culture, because they understood that there are a lot of elements of the Ghassanid culture or the Ghassanid kingdom which was completely Romanized. So they wanted to de-Romanize it, and the inclusion of these ancient pagan rituals such as stoning the devil at Mina, the three pillars there, and going around circumambulating a particular structure, or the relishing the memory of Abraham's footprints to show that this is also part of the promised land. So all these activities point out to the fact that they wanted to de-Sassanize and they wanted to de-Romanize their new found cult, and they believed that they were God chosen ones, and the apocalypse was at hand, and that they were and that they were living at the end of time, at the edge of history, or whatever you want to call it. And they believe that they were the ones who were the saved ones, and Muhammad will be the first one to be resurrected, like Jesus was resurrected 700 years ago. So they sincerely believed in all these things. I think we need to get into their minds and talk like them and argue like them to get more closer to the truth. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to something Lloyd mentioned about the Gnostic readings of the Quran. I was talking to a member of the Alawites there about a week ago, and one of the things he mentioned was that in their faith, they are conscious of different layers of meaning. So it's very explicit there. I think the same would be said for the Druze as well, and they're very much influenced by Neoplatonistic ideas. And I think if we were to do like a heat map of Syria and Lebanon and so on, where the different sects are, I think we'd really get to the source of a lot of these ideas. I wanted to ask you, why would the Abbasids confirm a place like Mecca? Let's say the Umayyads had decided upon this place. Surely it was in the Abbasids' interest to make their own place. So just throw that out to you. Anyone like to respond to that question? Why did the Abbasids stick with this location? Why did they not find another location more suitable for themselves?
Okay.
Firstly, the Umayyads were the victors in 695, and they could have relocated it back to from wherever it was, but they didn't choose to do so because they felt that holding on to political power, and they did not want a repetition of a Zubairid or a Mukhtarite or a Hussein kind of a revolt ever again. I'm just giving you examples. These things may or may not have happened. Umayyads were focused on the fact that there should be no more political rebellion from the fringes of their empire, and they just want to keep their place secure. So that is why Umayyads avoided the change of the territory. Okay. Now coming to the Abbasids also did not want to disturb the status quo, because the initial first 50 years of the Abbasid Caliphate till the middle of the rule of Harun al-Rashid was a very, very troublesome period, because they were more invested in fighting against the rebellions of someone like Ustad Sis or the followers of Behafared, or the followers of Sunpad, or the followers of Abu Muslim. So they were invested in fighting out and quelling the rebellions and the fires that were lit by, Al-Mukanna, way in the far east. So they did not bother much about this, and they felt that it was a very, very safe place to keep that. But they had essentially shifted the political-religious center to Baghdad. The epicenter of Islam was very much at Baghdad during the first 200 years of the Abbasids.
Okay, does anyone else want to come in on that, or even open up a new area of discussion? So I'm going to open the floor a little bit.
Hello? Is it possible that I could make a comment on what Bala said?
Yes, absolutely.
I found what Bala said very, very interesting before. Particularly this distinction between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. It seems to me that the Umayyads, the lie, I regard it all as a big lie. The traditional life of Muhammad it's not a case of exaggeration or people forgetting things or building up pious fictions to be spiritually uplifting. I see the whole thing as essentially dishonest and an attempt to obscure the truth. And the question is why? Why were people trying to obscure the truth, having got this Quran, which is seems to have been somewhat popular. People were making manuscripts. People are creating traditions. So it seems to have got some people who've been making laws on it. And so it seems to have had a lot of popular hold. So why were the rulers so anxious to separate it from its meaning? We might have expected them to be a lot more celebratory of it and regard it as a great moment in Arabic civilization, the creation of their first and one of their greatest works. But it seems to me that the lie started under the Umayyads. The Umayyads were the first people, or the dishonesty had begun by long before 750 in the Abbasid revolution. But the Umayyads, although they were somewhat dishonest with their approach, they were still very much of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So they would build the Dome of the Rock, which is a Judeo-Christian shrine, possibly Muhammad's mausoleum. I think I'm very much taken by that thesis. We know that the Umayyads continue to use Christian iconography. There are crosses that appear in some of their inscriptions. We know that they employed John of Damascus, who was a Christian in a very senior position. So the Umayyads still seem to come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So although they're trying to bury Muhammad, they haven't created yet a completely fictitious circumstance. But then it's the Abbasids who, when they take over in 750, they're the ones who really separate the story from any real links with Christianity or Judaism. I find that's very interesting. So the Abbasids, one assumes from that, didn't come from a Judeo-Christian tradition at all. They must have come from somewhere, maybe to the east, or somewhere where they just didn't have that same familiarity or knowledge or respect or adherence to the Bible, and that they were anxious to create a completely separate connection, whereas the Umayyads still wanted to keep that connection somewhat.
I agree. I fully agree with Paul. There is something there. The Umayyad added a sort of connection with the Judeo-Christian background, and they tried to cut it off, and the Abbasid followed on and cut it off completely. And we can see this in the creation of Baghdad in itself. Baghdad is a complete new city, an ideological city, an ideal city, set with it's an architect's dream. You see the map is in shape of a circle, and it's a complete new city. And this tells us about their way of thinking. The Abbasid rulers invented themselves as rulers and as being God's lieutenant on earth. So they couldn't invent anything. If you can invent Baghdad, you can invent Mecca. You can invent siras after siras. You can invent the life of a prophet. You can invent new meanings to the sacred text. And I think this was their way of thinking. They were the God-chosen rulers of earth, so they could do anything they wanted.
And we come out of there.
Well, the site of Baghdad, Odon, actually, the Abbasids honestly believed that they were the Neo-Babylonians. Mm-hmm. They believed that they were building Baghdad on the site of the ancient Babylon, although they had got the site wrong. But they honestly believe that they are the Neo-Babylonians, and they are the ones who are here to stay until the end of time, right? So that is about Baghdad. Mel, I want to make a very important point on the structure of Mecca as we see it today. Okay, yeah. It is not like a synagogue. Mecca is not a synagogue. Mecca is not a church. Mecca is trying to point out to something new. What they were trying to do is, they were trying to show with the footprint of Abraham and all the other prophets and all the important relics that were kept around the ancient Mecca, they were trying to show that they have maintained the ancient religion of Moses, saying that this is like the structure of the tabernacle. So they were trying to keep the tabernacle tradition of Moses. And we know why Moses went for this square cube box. He has shifted from the pyramid system to the this box system. So just like Paul mentioned, that Muhammad was a new Moses, and Mecca was the new center of worship, and that was the ancient tabernacle. And these believers believe that they retained the covenant with the true God, and all the other religions were polluted. all the Judeo-Christian traditions were polluted. So that is what they honestly believe. I'm asking you all to go back to the mindset of the 7th century and the 8th century believers and think like them and talk like them, even now.
Okay, I'm going to bring Lloyd in. I think you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Well said, Bala. On that point, at least within one of the traditions within the Sira, the Kaaba in Mecca is claimed to be the very first building built on Earth. It's the oldest temple on Earth. Now, it's a claim which I don't think has any evidence, but the claim is made. So therefore, if they're going back to the root, then they're claiming that they are the source of all religions, because the monotheism that they claim that Jesus was a monotheist, they claim that Moses was a monotheist, and when they speak of monotheism in the Old Testament or the New Testament, they are referring to a proto-Islam. It's this proto-monotheism that preceded Islam, which was perfected with Muhammad. So therefore, if they're going back to the oldest building on earth, then they're going to the root of God's own religion, of Allah's own religion. So it suits their myth making, which is found within the Sira.
Okay, I wanted to bring up another kind of area, just at the transition between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. We have, make sure you got the name, Marwan II, 744 to 750. And he was stationed in Haran, of all places, not Baghdad, not Damascus, not down in Mecca. And what's interesting about the location that he picked to have his palace, it was the site of the old god Sen, or a temple dedicated to Sen. And what's interesting is there is a connection there between Ramadan and and that old cult. Nabonidus was the person who spread the cult of the god Sen into Arabia, and they had a 30-day fast. Any thoughts on that whole issue, and why did that not become their center? Why was it that they abandoned Haran and kept to Baghdad, or even in fact transfer everything to Baghdad? Any thoughts on that? Bala.
Well, you brought up a very interesting point, because Marwan II was the last Umayyad ruler who ruled from Damascus. After that, they shifted to Cordoba. We know that story. Now, he came to power under very interesting circumstances. At the fall of Hisham, the second Walid, and the second Yazid. So there was a quick succession of caliphs, and there was a very, very quick oscillation between the Qaisi candidate and the Yemeni candidate. Now, he himself being a Qaisi candidate, he wanted to keep away from the power structure and the power struggles of Damascus. He was the governor of Armenia when his predecessor was killed under mysterious circumstances. Now, he marches into Damascus successfully. He finds the environment very, very dangerous for himself, and he moves to Haran. And Haran, we know, is the site of the famous cult of Sen, which continued till the time of Al-Mamun, at least till 825 or 830. So, and the symbol, the crescent and the star symbol, comes from the cult of Haran, the cult of Sen. And many other symbols and practices of early Islam has come from that particular moon worshipping cult. And what you said about Marwan's behavior and his attitude was very much in sync with the cult of Sen. However, he had too many detractors, including the person of Zaid ibn Ali, who was executed in a very brutal manner by Hisham in 742, leading to a huge revolt in the Kufa region. Now, Marwan was not a very, very favorite among the Umayyads or even among the non-Umayyads. So he wanted to keep himself safe, so that's why he stayed in Haran, and he had very little say about Mecca, or he never entered Mecca at all, to tell you the truth. As a caliph, he never entered into Mecca at all.
Anyone like to come into that, Odin?
No, I was just pointing that your mic was turned off.
Yeah.
Was turned off.
Yeah. Actually, while you're there, Odin, I was going to ask you a question. one of the pieces of evidence that we think we have is St. John of Damascus, who refers to, not by name, but refers to this location and poo-poos the idea of it being a location for Abraham. But you brought up an interesting idea that this mightn't actually be really connected with St. John of Damascus. Do you want to talk about that?
I think there is a debate among scholars about the datation of John of Damascus, of some of John of Damascus writings about Islam, or what was supposed to be Islam at the time. Especially the Mecca question and the existence of Muhammad as a prophet, because it's a bit odd. It does not fit what we know outside of John of Damascus writings, and also we know of John of Damascus writing. We have Greek manuscripts or Greek copies of his writing. And he is pointing at Islam as a sort of fully formed religion, fully fledged religion, and as the last religion, the 99th or the 100th of his list of heresies. And there is also something very strange. He was a sort of clerk for the Umayyads, and how come someone like him, stemming from a family who served the former Umayyads, could write such a harsh critic about Islam without retaliation? This is very strange. So some people think that parts of his writing about Islam or proto-Islam might be apocryphal. They might have been written in Byzantium in order to benefit from the statue, from the image of John of Damascus. So we are not very sure about the datation.
Thanks, Odin. Going to open up the floor to anyone who'd like to just jump in with any thoughts now at this stage. Lloyd, did you want to? Or Paul?
Just on what Odin was saying, it is very peculiar, the John of Damascus statement. If he was disrespectful towards the Quran and Muhammad, that is something that we could easily try to explain. We could say, well, the Umayyads were not fans of Muhammad and the Quran, that they saw it as a threat to their power. They tolerated it, and they maybe adopted some of the iconography and the terminology, like saying Muhammad Rasul Allah and the odd phrase here and there, but they didn't really want to encourage it very much, and they were tolerating it and taking as much of it as they needed to. But what's really interesting about John of Damascus is how little he seems to have known. When one reads that famous passage, one gets there's a conflicting element. On the one hand, he seems that he doesn't know that there's a book called the Quran. It seems as though he's never read the Quran. He deals with 4 books as though they are separate books, as though he's not aware they form part of one tradition, and he doesn't really seem to know about the others. But then, by the same token, he does seem to know the Surah of the Camel, which isn't part of the Quran, as though almost he knows a book that's since been lost. So it is a very, very interesting situation. The disrespect for the Quran and Muhammad, one could accommodate that within any number of different theories. But the fact that he doesn't know the Quran and yet he seems to know something about it that nobody else knows is very, very interesting. It seems to show that the Quran manuscripts, if they are being produced and they're circulating, they're not making their way to the Umayyad court, and the Umayyads are not very keen on people reading them.
Did you want to come in on something, Lloyd? Your audio?
Yes, a couple of
Sorry.
points I'd like to raise. So in terms of this particular topic, you guys are specialists in the area, and it's actually very enlightening to listen to all three of you, and yourself as well, Mel. Just in terms of Mecca, Islam does claim, if people are not familiar, within the ijma, within the Sharia of Islam, they do claim that Muhammad's message was final, and that Islam abrogates all previous religions. All previous religions, especially Christianity, Judaism, become din al-batil. So din al-batil means these are the abrogated, well, technically these are the worthless religions. These are the religions where your words do not reach Allah. They turn to dust and they fall at your feet. Allah doesn't listen to us anymore. So Islam becomes the din al-haq, the religion of truth. But actually the word is much more than truth. It's a completely, well, it's got a much deeper meaning than that. But they do say that for Muslims to affirm affirming these religions' validity, but denying or not mentioning their abrogation, it is unbelief or kufr to hold that the remnant cults now bearing the names of formerly valid religions, such as Christianity or Judaism, are acceptable to Allah after He has sent the final messenger to the entire world. This is a matter over which there is no disagreement among Islamic scholars. So if we are unclean, they might have needed to go to a location that was a fresh start, to separate themselves completely with a fresh start, because this is the official ijma position on Islam of all religions. So Christianity is batil is worthless. It means pointless, but also batil is one of the names of Satan. So we are the religions of Satan. And then on a different point, if with regards to Mecca, there's some interesting points that you guys have all raised. But if you have a city, and Mecca would seem to be standing alone, you would obviously want, and one of the things I know that Jay discusses, and I think yourself, Odon, as well, are the coins, right? As verifiable, very strong evidence. But if you have something that would have stood possibly as a city-state, and they claim that it's the mother of all cities or something of that nature, then you'd be able to define what did its economy consist of, right? What did it trade? What did it not trade in, right? What form of government did it have? Who were its leaders, right? There's a whole list of questions you can go through and ask about any sort of location like that, right? What was the religion of that location? What was the name of its currency, right? There's a whole list of questions you can run through. And none of that is available. So therefore, clearly, there's an issue. I mean, so if you just apply the same kind of logic you would to, if you want to examine the existence of France, for argument's sake, what were its borders? When were they established? What was its currency called? And all of these questions have answers. Mecca meets none of these criteria. It fails them. So I think basically in terms of, one, there was political reasons, there were the historical reasons, and also there's the theological reasons. They needed possibly a fresh start, and that's me.
Mm-hmm. Mike? We don't hear you, Mel. Mel?
Sorry. Lloyd, a question for you. Where do you think the anti-Judeo-Christian laws of wife-beating, halal marriage, giving 100 lashes to adulterers, and shutting them indoors, etc., come from? I think that's probably your sort of question.
Interesting question. Yeah. Okay, so the people who make the laws within Islam are called the mujtahids. Now, you've got the highest level of mujtahids, or the mujtahids mutlaq. Those would be the guys who founded the four schools of fiqh, Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi. They are the absolute scholars. That's what the mujtahids mutlaq are. But also, these guys are, there's a, you know what? There's a word that I need to find. It's not in this book. But very shortly, if you've heard of antinomianism, this means that this is an inversion of the law of God. It's against the law. So it's against the law of God. Now, if Islam has a genuine Gnostic root, or if it has a Gnostic element within it, because it's obviously got its own little shadings on this issue, it believes if Christianity is the Deen al-Batil, if we are the religions of Satan, then Yahweh is Satan. And Allah would be the opposite of Satan. So therefore, they've got to defy the laws of Moses. They've got to defy the laws of Yahweh. And therefore, they have to do the inversion. They've got to thus defy the laws of the Ten Commandments. right? So therefore, if it has this, I would say there's a Gnostic element there, which means that they've got to invert all of that, because within Islam, if you look at some of the Gnostic elements, they do speak of Islam believes, for instance, within the Sharia, Islam claims that the earth and all that is within it is cursed, which is very much a Gnostic concept, that the world of matter is cursed. So there's, I'll try and keep it short and end there, but basically it's an inversion of the law of the Old Testament as well as the law of God.
It seems to me that related with that is the need to have an in crowd and an out crowd. So the way you distinguish yourselves from the others is that inversion. I was thinking about that actually today. I was thinking about the Muslims who are living in Western countries who have been wearing burqas to distinguish themselves from Westerners, and they've covered up their faces, obviously. But since the crisis with COVID and everyone is now masked, I wonder, are they now struggling to distinguish themselves, from the other masked people? Do you know what I mean? So it's almost like it's not really about religious identity. It's more about establishing that they're different. Do you know what I mean? It's not necessarily they're following a particular diktat of their religion, but more a case of saying, how are we different from the others? Anyone like to come in on that? Or on any other point? No?
Not especially.
Not especially. Okay. Well, if anyone has got a question for the team, please feel free. I've got no more questions here from my end. Okay, I think we'll probably wrap it up here. It's probably a good point to finish. Listen, I'd like to thank.
Sorry, Bill. Just come in there. I was looking up because as I was, you probably saw from my eyes, you can never get your hand on the right snippet of information when you need it. But the question about the wife beating verse, for the so-called wife beating verse, Surah 4 verse 34. Was the subject of a very interesting article that I read. It was actually published this year. It's by somebody called Saqib Hussain, and the article is called "The Bitter Lot of the Rebellious Wife: Hierarchy, Obedience, and Punishment in Quran 4:34." And Hussain deals with the similarities between the so-called wife beating verse and the practice of a wife leaving a man in the book of Numbers. I've got the actual reference, Numbers chapter 5 verses 1 to 31, and it's too complex and detailed for me to go into now. But when I think he satisfies me that 4:34 is not some crude, if your wife disobeys you, give her a bit of a slap and then she'll come round. But it's a lot more theological than that. So much of the Quran has meaning, but it's buried very deep, and you really need to pick up on the subtle connections between that and other verses. I mean, I would say that a lot of the Quran, the passages relating to slavery, to having sex with your slaves, to the violent jihad, can be related to passages of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It's not simply a freestyle tyrant making it up as he goes along. There is actually a meaning to this, but it's rather sophisticated to put in that 5 minutes just as you're saying goodbye. It's a little bit more of a story, but there is actually a lot more to that verse. I would just like to put that in there.
There's a question here, if anyone would like to take it.
And Mel, can I add something about the wife beating?
Yes, yeah.
It comes only now to my mind. I should have thought about it earlier. You see, I think I've made the point with you and in my book, and especially it's Dr. Edouard Marie-Galais who made this point, that at the origins of Islam, or at least the origins of the Quran and one of the Arab factions, there was a Jewish Nazarene group that might have come from the 1st century, maybe even before, and some of its religion, some of its way of thinking can be found in some of the Qumran manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In there is a manuscript about the women, which tells about the role of women as being a sort of handicap. They prevent the men from fighting in the cause of God. And because of this, they have to be secluded in the houses, educated, and so on. And this is something maybe that was brought to the 7th century by this Jewish Nazarene group. And this is maybe one of the reasons why we find it in the Quran. Also, in most of the Messianist ideologies, the role of women is always lessened. We don't want women to, the ideologist who wants to establish a perfect kingdom, a perfect world, see womanhood as something that could prevent the warriors from achieving the goal, from establishing God's kingdom on earth, or from making the revolution, for example. And so women, the womanhood, the role of women is lessened. So either women are secluded in their homes, or they are made into men, such as in Soviet Russia, for example, or in China, in communist China. So this is something about the wife beating. And also another point, it is about the sex with slaves. I've done a video with Jay Smith on this topic, explaining Guillaume's D article. Guillaume D is a French Islamologist, very proficient scholars on Quranic studies, and he proved that there had been some interpolation in some surahs about the permission to have sex with slaves. And it was an interpolation to a sort of, at the beginning, those surahs, those passages were very Christian-like. They looked a lot like instructions for catechumens or for monks. And in the middle, an interpolation was made in order to permit sex with slaves, telling the believers that you have to be chaste, but it's okay to have sex with slaves. So for people who want details, they can find this video on J. Smith's channels or mine.
Okay, I just want to respond to a question that was there, which is, when did the pagan Arabs become Muslims? According to Yehuda Nevo, there were pagan sites until about the 750s, so it's probably in the early 8th century. There's a point here from Dreamily Resonant Feet. Someone's audio's on there. Could you switch off your audio, please? Thanks. There was a point here from Dreamily Resonant. The name Muawiyah comes from the word Moabite, in Hebrew, Moavi, but in Arabic they have no V, so they used a W, Muawiyah. Any thoughts on that?
There are numerous similarities. When we discussed the origin of the Sharia, the development of the Sharia law on your channel, we discussed a number of terms that were borrowed from the original Hebrew words. So yeah, I'd say it's plausible, certainly. Can I mention something with regards to that previous question, if I may? I'll try and be brief.
Absolutely.
There's plenty of doctrine within Islam that talks about antinomianism. They have a name for it, Ibaha. Ibaha is the doctrine that allows the higher level scholars to, it's called allowing the forbidden. So the higher level scholars are allowed to break the law. Now, it should be noted that every single law in Islam it's permitted to break it. If you believe you have a reason, you can break. So nothing is sacrosanct. Everything is, shall we say, fluid. On top of that, the Sharia, there are two main pillars. There are 6 main pillars that are identified within the Sharia, but 2 of them are interesting. One's called al-darura tubi al-masuhrat, and the other one is al-maqasida min al-wasail. So these basically say necessities permit the forbidden. If you feel it's necessary, you may break the law. You may do the taboo. You may do what is forbidden, what is haram. And the last one is really interesting. The aims are more important than the means. The ends justify the means. This is one of the pillars of the Sharia. So there's plenty. If you look at the doctrine of deception, the doctrine of lying within Islam, you have every right to break. So really Islam is built upon this, where you're allowed, because short version, God is logos, Allah is will. If you are the vice regent of Allah on earth, you can practice your will. Nothing gets in the way of your will. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, it's. I find it is quite interesting in the Quran when you're alert to it that that God and His Prophet seem to use precisely the same language for their own actions as they do for the actions that they're disapproving of. So Satan leads men astray, but God also leads men astray. And the Pharaoh tortures people and uses a particular word that is sometimes translated as crucify. But then God also instructs his people to uses exactly the same phrase. The amputation of limbs from opposite sides is something that Pharaoh does, and something that the God instructs people to do time and again. The same words. God is the best of plotters. They plot, but God is the best of plotters. And God's it's quite striking that the Quran uses precisely the same verbs for the enemies of God as God Himself either does or instructs His obedient servants to do. So it's very interesting and ties in a lot, I think, with what Lloyd was saying. What is important? It's a question of allegiance. It's not a question of some actions are objectively good or objectively bad. It's about whose side are you on. Always that.
Okay, I just want to kind of bring us back to the focus on Mecca here for a moment. One theory that some have proposed is that it all started in Jerusalem and then it moved to Petra and then via Petra onto Mecca. I just wanted to throw that out there. It's a thesis that Jay Smith holds to. It's not one I personally hold to, but there's obviously a need to deal with the Qibla question. Does anyone want to refer to that whole question of Petra and how it fits into all of this? Who'd like to go? Odon?
Yes, let's get on with it. About this Qibla question, this Qibla issue, there is something very interesting in what Dan Gibson discovered, but one has to keep in mind that Gibson only has material for the second half of the 7th century and after. And there is almost nothing in Gibson discoveries about the early 7th century, which was the beginning of Islam or proto-Islam. And but we have material, I think, that dates from the early 7th century, which is the Quran, not the whole of the Quran, because as you know, the Quran is a very rewritten text and a very edited text. But in the Quran, there is something about the Qibla. And what we can read in the Quran is that the preacher who speaks urges his audience to change the Qibla, to change the orientation of the prayer from the rising sun to Jerusalem, and not from Jerusalem to Mecca. The Jerusalem to Mecca change is an invention of the standard Islamic narrative, which was made in order to fit the Mecca issue, to force the meaning of the Quran into the creation of Mecca as a place of origin, whereas the literal Quranic text is very clear about the former Qibla. It tells about the people looking at the heavens, and it says that you should not look at the. I say it from memory. I'm not Hafiz. You should not look at the heavens because the rising sun belongs to God. So quit with this tradition, because Qibla also means tradition, what was before. It doesn't mean explicitly direction of prayer. It's like in the Jewish Kabbalah, it's the same root. And so the text say, quit with this rising sun Qibla and pray toward the Masjid al-Haram, so pray toward Jerusalem. But if you do this, you will not be like the Jews who already do this. You will not be like the people of the book. So about this Qibla question, there is something that Dan Gibson has completely missed, which is the Quranic studies. And this is really what all I have in terms of critics, about Gibson's work, is that he only looks at what he has found, and he doesn't look at the big picture. He doesn't look at the Quranic studies. He doesn't look, for example, at the other archaeological discoveries and so on. And because of this, his theory about Petra, I think, is flawed. I think it is flawed. He doesn't know, for example, of this previous Qibla change from the Christian tradition of praying toward the rising sun to Jerusalem, which is stated in the Quran.
Paul, did you want to comment on that?
Yes. I think there's some merit in the idea that Petra did play a role in this. I don't think that Dan Gibson's thesis in its detail is correct. And Dan Gibson basically takes the seerah, takes the life of Muhammad, and he places it all inside Petra. I don't think that the life of Muhammad that is told in the seerah ever happened. It may have been created around somebody who knew Petra and who placed all these fictitious events there, but I don't think that it actually happened there. However, Petra may still play a role. I think that Dan Gibson has a good point. I'm persuaded that many Umayyad buildings were oriented towards Petra. I think the two that I find most persuasive are the Dome of the Chain, which is immediately next to the Dome of the Rock, and it's a structure that seems primarily built in order to point people into a particular direction. And the places are so close, one could just go on Google Earth and draw a line, and it's absolutely self-evident to me that this is pointing people towards Petra. And the other is the Church of the Katisma, which is also very old, and that also has a mihrab niche, which again is pointing in the direction of Petra. But there are plenty of other buildings around there, and as you line it up and as you go through them, Great Mosque of Damascus, the Hisham's Palace, which has recently opened to tourists on the West Bank, you find these, they do all point very closely towards Petra. So Petra seems to have had some significance to the Umayyads. Of course, that doesn't mean it had any significance at all to Muhammad. The other point I would make is that Mecca is mentioned in the Quran, and what it tells us is that it was in a valley. It talks about an event that happened in the valley of Mecca, and there were some people that the Quranic audience were preparing to go to battle with, but they ended up forming and these people are described as mushrikun. They are described as standing in the way of or turning the Muslims away from Jerusalem, and they are described as I forget what the other one was, but they are that might have just been the two things, and they were preparing to go to war, and then there seems to have been their hands were turned away from fighting, and the Quran presents this as a great victory. So it's clear from that context that the Quran author, I think, the Quran author went to a valley somewhere, met some enemies that were standing in their way to Jerusalem, and he called that the Valley of Mecca, or Valley of Mecca. And that could be any valley, but it could easily be Petra. If Petra was sacred to or special to the Umayyads may well have been those people, Abu Bakr and so on, may well have been the very people that Muhammad was thinking about fighting, and they came to some sort of deal, and they stood aside or maybe formed an alliance, and then allowed Muhammad to press on to invade Palestine. Petra's the right sort of place. It's a valley, and it's clearly of some religious significance to their rivals. So Dan Gibson's work isn't in vain. I think he's got a lot of he's got some interesting findings there, and Petra may well turn out to have quite a role to play in this.
Bala, do you want to come in on that?
Well, Mel, I was just reading the comment section. Two very interesting comments. One was a question asking what is the role of Medina in shaping up the city of Mecca, because today they're known as twin cities, but nowhere in the previous literature of, let's say, even 800s or 900s are these two cities referred to as twin cities, because to be referred to as twin cities, both these need to have an origin at the same point in time. And the other comment that is made by someone called Max, he says that Mecca basically means the place of rest. So it just gets corroborated with the modern narrative as well as the standard Islamic narrative that Mecca was a temporary place to hide the the black stone for a while. So it was a temporary place. It became it became permanent and became concretized and rigidified over the because of political circumstances over the centuries, and after that it became immutable, like the general religion of Islam itself. But initially I think it was meant to for safekeeping from safekeeping of the black stone and the other relics like the Rukn Ibrahim and all those things from the Umayyads, and then it became a permanent place somehow.
Any thoughts on that, Lloyd?
Lloyd,
your audio?
No, I'd have to go and research that before I would comment. I'd need to spend some time digging deeper, but I've learned a great deal on this show as well already.
Something maybe here. I'm not that knowledgeable about Medina and what happens there, but there is something very strange when Bala is talking about the twin cities. When we look at what the standard Islamic narrative is telling us about Mecca, it's supposed to be the place of origin, and it is supposed to be the place of merchants and trade. So one could assume that with the victory of the Arabs and the establishment of the Caliphate, Mecca should have prospered, and Meccan trade should have boomed. But there is absolutely no trace of a Meccan trade, even after the Arab conquest, which is very, very, very odd. There is a trace of a Meccan slave trade in the 19th century, but that's all. And there is nothing with Mecca. So, and it is even in a way, it is even in the standard Islamic narrative. All the Qurayshi victorious Arabs, none of them came back to Mecca. The Caliph, the first so-called Rashidun Caliphs, ruled from Medina, and they never went back to Mecca. And so this is a clue that Mecca did not exist at the time. And another thing about Mecca, and I think it should be said in our chat, there was never a consensus about Mecca among the Muslim scholars of the 9th or 10th century. There was a very harsh debate among themselves about the Mecca question that was looked upon as a rida, an innovation. And there was a very tragic and enormous event in the 10th century. A faction of Muslims, the Karmatians, there were some sort of Shia Muslims, did not agree with the Mecca being erected as the place of origin and the city of the Prophet, and they were located in the western shore of the Persian Gulf, so in the other side, the eastern side of Arabia, and they went through the deserts to Mecca and ransacked the place, destroyed everything, filled the Zamzam well with bodies, and they stole the black stone. So we see that the Muslim did not agree about the status of Mecca, even in the 10th century or 11th century. And the black stone that we see today, we are not sure whether it is the actual true black stone, because it was recovered from the Karmatians something like 70 years ago, after the sack of Mecca by the Abbasid Caliph, who paid a good ransom to get it back. So maybe it was at this time that it was shattered into several pieces, but still we cannot be sure that it is the real, actual black stone.
I just want to share a thought there. One of the most inaccessible places in the world is probably the summit of Everest. And yet there are more artifacts up there on the summit just from the past 100 years than there has been in Mecca for all that period, which would suggest that very few people have been going there over the centuries. Otherwise, we should see an awful lot of inscriptions and little monuments and so on built there from all of these millions and millions of pilgrims over the centuries. I know Bala wants to come in, so I'm just going to pass it to you, Bala.
I wanted to confirm what Odon said. See, there were this cult of these, proto-communists or proto-Bolsheviks called the Karmatians. The Karmatians actually wanted to shift the Qibla to their homeland in Bahrain. So they invade Mecca, which is forbidden actually, and they take away the black stone and all the other relics to their place in the hope of shifting the Qibla of the entire Islamic world towards their homeland, in which they failed miserably. The man who did it is called Tahir bin Sulaiman. He did that in the early 10th century, only to return it back after some 36 years or something. He returns it back at the Mosque of Basra. He throws the black stone tied up in a sack where it is broken into 7 pieces. Now, these pieces are amalgamated together using some kind of a gel or something, or a cementing substance, and it is kept back at Mecca, and the cube is rebuilt. Actually, the cube itself is rebuilt the 7 times. So one does not need to keep today's picture in mind if you have to think of the 7th century. So what we have in front of us is basically an illusion. So it's very difficult to take out what was real and what was false. What one can say is the early membership to the believers movement was that you had to have a certain number of beliefs and you could follow your own religion of Judaism or Christianity or Zoroastrianism or anything. But the later membership became, the Jews, the Christians, and the Zoroastrians and the Manichaeans left the believers movement by the 690s because it had retained too many pagan elements in it, and it was irreconcilable with their own personal religion, as well as the fact that the apocalypse was not arriving, and this prophet was not getting resurrected, and his companions were not getting resurrected. So all these points were running in the minds of the early believers who left the movement. And by the year 820 or 830, there were no more Jews at all left in the fold of Islam anymore. So from then onwards, Islam becomes a independent cult or religion, as you want to call it. And as it is, the Christians had left very well by after the death of Muawiyah. As we can see, John of Damascus is a greatest critique of early Islam, and the other people like the Zoroastrians obviously hated Muslims. Let's say around from 640 onwards. So the exit of the non-Muslim believers was clearly evident, and nobody approved of Mecca as a holy place, and nobody made pilgrimage to it. I mean, the Jews, the Christians, and the Zoroastrian believers never made pilgrimage to Mecca. We must remember. Thank you.
There's a question here: why is the Saudi Arabia very reserved when it comes to giving access to archaeologists? Anyone like to?
Anything that embarrasses
Islam basically
is forbidden.
No, Islam basically hates archaeology. It wants you to get disconnected from your past. It wants you to forget that your forefathers were Christians or your forefathers were Hindus. Look, you can change your religion, but you can't change your forefathers' religions and their beliefs. They're dead and they're gone. They lived by their convictions and they died for it. So, not only the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Muslims discourage archaeology in Jordan, and they don't allow digging around the Temple Mount. If there is one proper archaeological dig around the Temple Mount and around Jerusalem, the whole truth about Islam will come up, and Islam will show up to be much less younger. If you perceive it to be 1400, I would call it that it is only 900,000 years old, because I believe true Islam began only with someone like Al-Ghazali. Thank you.
Okay, Odon, do you want to jump in on that one?
I fully agree with Bala. This is also what I wanted to say. But with Prince bin Salman and even before him, there has been a sort of opening to archaeology, but not in Mecca, not in Medina, not in the sacred sites. But there is archaeological work in the north, in Madain Saleh, for example. And in France, there have been numerous expositions of archaeological remains and discoveries. But I think the Saudis allows it because it shows the Jahiliyyah, the so-called Jahiliyyah. It shows the way their forefathers, who were supposed to, their pagan forefathers lived. So it is kind of in accordance with Islam.
Yeah, I'd like just to mention, if I could, we've been mentioning or talking about the lack of evidence for Mecca. When it comes to Yathrib, there is documentary evidence Yathrib did exist. However, on the subject of archaeology, one question that I've never heard anyone provide an answer for, if there are any Muslim viewers out there who have an answer, and that is, where's the trench? According to the traditional narrative, Muhammad dug a great trench around Yathrib, around Medina, and this trench must have been wide enough and deep enough to hold an army at bay. So it can't just be a few feet. It can't be something that you can leap over. It must be something that was so big that an invading army would get held up by it for a significant period of time. Yet one can go on, as I say, back on Google Earth again. If you can go onto Google Earth and have a look at it, there's nowhere obvious where such a trench could possibly have been created. It doesn't. The landscape doesn't lend itself to that. But in any event, there's no sign of a trench. I mean, who went and filled it in to destroy the
Well, we don't find the crack or the split of the moon and the trench. Both are just absent. I think they're just only in books and in folklore.
It's also the same with the Battle of Badr. There is huge stories. There are huge stories about this battle, but it was invented only to fit a certain verse where there is Badr. But I know a French scholar, Aramaic and Hebrew scholars, who made a translation of the Quran, a bit like Christoph Luxemburg, but before him, and he thought that the Badr meant something else, and that the Muslim invented the story of the battle because either they did not know what the verse meant, or they wanted to be creative. And it's the same with so many stories about early Islam, especially, for example, the Mount Arafat. There is only one mention, one occurrence of this in the Quran. And if we look into it, it could be read differently without being a mount, the Mount Arafat. Arafat is it is an Aramaic root. It is about banking or trading, and the verse is telling the believers that when they come to Jerusalem, it is fine for them to sell their goods and their slaves before coming to the Masjid al-Haram. This could be the actual, original meaning of the verse, but it was transformed by the Islamic narrative, and he invented a Mount Arafat, and nowadays there is a Mount of Arafat in Mecca.
Yes, I think on the Odin, you mentioned Christoph Luxemburg, and I think his translation was that Badr or some word or combination of words that fits the continental skeleton reads an auxiliary troop, didn't he? And he said that the auxiliary troop, the battle of the auxiliary troop, ties in extremely well with the way the Quran presents it, which is that God sent down 3,000 angels to fight with the Muslims when they were lowly, and it fits the context of the verse perfectly. That it was an auxiliary troop, not the name of a place.
Lloyd,
If I may add something, it is illegal to embarrass Islam. It technically can be construed as treason if it's an insult to Allah, and Muslims have to make a calculus before they state anything. If the truth would cause more harm than the lie, then it is obligatory for Muslims to lie. This is the Sharia law. On top of that, in terms of some of the embellishment, Islam has a doctrine called, well, it's actually a rhetorical, quote-unquote, science, a rhetorical science called the Ilm al-Badi, which is about the beautification of literary style, and it's about the artifice and the ornamentation and embellishment, or the artifices of ornamentation and embellishment of speech. So it's part of the culture. It's one of their sciences, how to use artifice, which is deception, rhetoric, deceit, lies, to embellish speech. On top of that, if you look at the tradition, if you go back into the Jahiliyyah, right, into the condition of ignorance, that during that period, it was very normal. Well, they believed that when people died, good or bad, you ended up in the same place, and it was a horrible place to go to. So the only way that you had a life to look forward to was if you were remembered in poetry. So the only way that you would be remembered was in poetry. So you wanted to commit acts or deeds or tell a story in such a way that it would be remembered within the poetry. And this tradition has obviously bled through and maintained its way into the Quran and into the traditions of Muhammad. So they're allowed to embellish, they're allowed to exaggerate to that degree if it benefits Islam. And then also, just one last point, what happened was poets were said to be mad. Now, you know that I think Quran 35:37 calls Muhammad a mad poet. Now, the poets of the Jahiliyyah were said to often be mad. They were driven mad because they were great poets, but they were said to be driven mad because they each would have a muse, and the muse was a demon called a jinn. and the jinn would inspire that poet and give him his words and allow him to speak and allow him to create this great poetry. So this might be something. It's part of the tradition that comes out of the Jahiliyyah that's now continued.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone like to jump in there?
I'm just holding.
We're all in the middle of researching. There's some great comments in the.
No, I'm just reading the comments.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to reply to our friends in the chat box, because they're coming up with a lot of nice statements, and one of that is idea that the archaeology and Islam don't go well, and they don't do archaeology at all in any of the countries which come under their domain, be it Iran or even Pakistan, or as far as Morocco also. So that is a very, very well established fact that is mentioned by our friends in the comment section. I'm trying to reply to most of them, but the point is, Mecca becomes the epicenter of Islam, and in hindsight, if we see, during the Mongol invasion of Hulagu, they reach up to Jerusalem. The Mongols reach up to Jerusalem, but then they are not able to go near Mecca. So the Muslims pat themselves in the back after the victory of Ruknuddin Barabbas in 1261, 1262. So in hindsight, keeping Mecca there was good, because if they had Mecca somewhere near Baghdad or somewhere near Jerusalem, it would have been overrun by the Mongols, and Islam would have lost its validity as the final and immortal religion. So in hindsight, they felt it's good to keep it deep in the desert, way far away from the hands of the enemies.
I just want to read. Sorry, I just want to read a comment from Chris Klaus. This is an awesome panel, tons of great info. We're blessed today. Thank you, Klaus, for that very kind comment, and I think that's a good reflection of a lot of the comments. And I think it's been a fascinating discussion. It's not one that I've been able to take part in because I was trying to act as host. I don't know if I've done a good job or not, but it's a bit like juggling in the air, trying to keep an eye on everything. But I thought it was really fascinating, all of the different contributions. I think we've lost Odon. Maybe it's an internet. Oh, he's back. There we go.
So technical incidents.
I figured that. Yeah, so I just think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. I think for anyone interested in the question of why did they move everything down to Mecca, I think there's loads of ideas, and I think the truth is in there in the mix. We may not have it all sorted, we may not have all the answers, but we certainly have got a substantial part of the answer. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities in the future for us all to gather again, hopefully with Jay Smith the next time, who's happily climbing up some mountain somewhere in the United States at the minute. So I'm sure.
I request all the panelists here and also the future speakers to have a session or a couple of sessions of how and why India never became Islamized, or rather the topic should be India and Islam, and how we Indians withstood Islamic invasions and retained our freedom successfully, because only very few nations have been able to resist Islam, like let's say Burma, India, Spain, or today's Israel. So I think you need to talk about the India story and its clash with Islam. So I kindly request all of you to participate in it, and Mel to host it someday. Thank you.
I would be more than happy, and I think there have been a number of viewers who've actually requested that. It's very much outside of my field of knowledge, so I don't know how the others feel, but perhaps there, in addition to yourself, Bala, there are viewers from India who are knowledgeable in that history, and if you're watching and you'd like to take part in that, just get in touch. Lost everyone. I think this might be worth doing on a regular basis, maybe once a month or every 5 or 6 weeks. It's good to bring everyone together and really kind of nail a particular topic and bring all your expertise to bear. It's fantastic. And Robert Spencer, I see someone mentioned Robert Spencer. I think I'd love to bring him on. I think he would be a very interesting individual to bring on and share his knowledge. Thank you, guys. It's been fascinating, and thank you so much for taking part. If any of you would like to kind of have a closing comment, now's your opportunity.
I think my closing comment, Mel, would be thank you very much for being such an excellent host, and also for getting us all together in the first place. I think it's been a very, very worthwhile exercise. It's been I think it's been possibly the most successful collaboration discussion between us, because we've tried it before and it hasn't always worked out, but it's worked very well today, I think. And thank you very much for doing that. I think you mentioned that there are a lot of ideas there. Different people have different starting positions and different conclusions, and so it's actually quite difficult for people to share their ideas or critique one particular idea, because people have such different frames of reference. But I think it's been very successful today, and thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Mel.
No, thank you.
You see, when we are doing research, there is no absolute truth. We have to confront our different point of views. We have to accept that we do not hold the truth, and to hear everyone, and to make the better of it.
Absolutely.
This is how it works.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Mel.
Well, thank you, Mel. Thank you much. Appreciate it. And really good to meet you two gentlemen as well. Thank you. I learned a great deal from both of you.
Great. Hope to chat again soon, Lloyd.
Thank
Yeah, I think there's a great benefit from bringing people together and having ideas bounce off each other, because it can open up new avenues of research and just to get to know each other and know that there's other people who are in the same field is very helpful. So thank you, guys. Hopefully next time we will have Murad and we'll have Jay, and maybe we could take on the question of India's history, or another question as well in the future. So thank you, guys, and talk to you all very soon. And thank you to all the kind comments in the chat today. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.